And without further ado, the event that everyone here is here for, we have Anastasia Ostrowski. She's a member of the Personal Robots group at MIT Media Lab, and she's here to talk about her research regarding the equitable co-design of robots. So I'm going to stop blabbering on and hand it over to Anastasia. The floor is yours, and thank you very much. Here we go.
Wonderful. Thanks for the introduction, and also thanks for inviting me. I'm going to be talking today about some of my work around the equitable design of robots. I had originally titled this as Equitable Co-Design of Robots because I've spent a lot of time doing co-design work, but then wanted to squeeze in a little bit of work from a different angle that I'll go more into in a bit. I'll go ahead and get started. Before I get into the body of the talk, I always like to acknowledge the people that really make this work happen. And so for a lot of my work, it's the co-designers. I couldn't do this without the community of really great, amazing older adults that I work with. Also, this project is sponsored from different government agencies as well as Samsung. And then some of the other things that I will talk about as well here have been done with a huge, amazing team of collaborators. So I always like to acknowledge them before I start. So let's get into the talk. I like to start with this quote, which is, "Technology is never neutral, and it promotes some values and demotes others." And what this really speaks to is that when we're designing things, morals and values are inevitably embedded into these things. And why I think about this with related to robots is that robots are a technology in their infancy. So it's a really key prime space for us to act now and think about, how do we engage more voices in the process? And how do we pay attention to the values and morals that we think about? And you may think, oh, well, this could be a far off problem, but it's actually already happening today. So for example, in Amazon warehouses, you see often news titles such as, "Robots alone can't solve Amazon's labor woes." And this was referenced to when they were implementing these robotic industrial systems. They didn't take into context how they were implementing them, and people were trying to match the efficiency levels of these robots, which was leading to safety concerns. You may be also familiar with this robot Spot that's built by Boston Dynamics. And recently, the New York Police Department acquired one, and there was this huge backlash with this creepy robot dog that is, losing job with the New York Police Department. And the NYPD robot dog's run is cut short after fierce backlash. And what was happening is these robots were being used in what people perceived as a very high surveillance system, where the police were using this system in public housing in Manhattan, and it was very emblematic and symboling of how overly aggressive the police can be when dealing with poor communities. And we have also seen pieces that really talk about drawing attention to the roboticists, and with people critically thinking and reflecting on, can we make our robots less biased than we are? And so there have been people who are coming forward and saying we need to end the injustices and how this technology is made and used. And then you think about these robots. So the robot on the right is Jibo, and then we have voice user interfaces, Amazon Alexa and Google Home. And these systems are also coming into new places, such as your home, and they could lead to new inequities being created or perpetuate inequities that already exist. So the question in my work kind of sits in kind of along these robotic spaces and thinking about, how do we support equitable design processes in robotics? And what I mean by equitable design is it's design that is interrogating the historical, cultural, social, and political inequities in society. It deconstructs the privilege of design methods, and it recenters the focus of design on individuals who are historically underserved. And so I'll be using that word a lot, but these are the things that I draw on when I talk about equitable design. And equitable design is really key, especially when robotics will have these impacts in spaces such as healthcare, education, and governance. And we're already hearing conversations about this. And there are people in the field who are really advocating for and pushing to have guidelines for responsible robot design, and that when we are creating these systems, we need to create them so that they have beneficial rather detrimental impacts on all segments of society. So I've kind of motivated the larger societal, why should we think this is important? But I also want to talk a little bit about sort of, why did I get into this area, and why have I specifically been focusing on equitable design? So I think it really boils down to this question for me, or where are the humans? When I got into technology design, I was very surprised that an engineer wasn't working like directly next to a user, which is how I had thought that that would kind of take place. And so for me, it really drew me to this area of like, well, let's think about users and stakeholders and how are they coming into our design processes. And as I did that, then I started thinking, well, that's great that I'm interested in this space, but what about other roboticists? And how do we really shift our thinking towards roboticists and how their design processes are really impacting this ecosystem? And the other people I see in this ecosystem are policymakers. And so I sort of see this ecosystem or kind of ecology of these different people and how they interact as very key to thinking about technology design. And so in some of my work, I've talked about these three stakeholders in this context of a technology design framework. And so the first question that I really ask in this framework is, what is being designed? So for my case, it's a robot, but it could be other technologies for other people. Really, I think focusing on disruptive technologies is a really interesting space when considering this framework and this question. But for me, it could be a robot like this. It could be an industrial robot. It could be a co-robot, and maybe it's even a spot robot. So it's kind of the robotic technology and what is being designed. And that is really structured and surrounded by these key areas of how do we support co-designers or users in this process? Who is designing this technology on the roboticist side? And then how should we engage in and regulate technology through policy? And how do these all three different groups all interact together? And where I really see the equitable design part coming into this is when we think about design justice. And so this is a term that is developed by the Design Justice Network, as well as described more in Costanza Chalk's work. But really what it is, it explores how is design relating to domination and resistance. When you design something, how does it afford both penalty and privilege to different people and provide resources? Specifically, this framework provides resources to question topics around things like equity and values and historic inequities that are related to technology. It also draws on a lot of and builds upon Black feminist scholarship on things such as intersectionality and the matrix of domination, which I'm happy to talk more about if people aren't as familiar about these topics. So this is the framework that I really situate all of my work in. And today I'm really going to focus on that top relationship. So the co-designers and then who is designing this technology. So first let's look into, well, when we talk about co-designers, what do we mean? And for me, this really is anchored in participatory design and co-design. And so these are design processes that really allow you to engage with the historical, cultural, social, and political aspects within design contexts that inevitably are there. And we can't not engage with them. It really allows you to step in and embrace those things. And it also really is a useful methodology to interrogate or think about reshaping inequities in society. Now, in human robot interaction, there has been work with co-design and participatory design. It's not as common of a methodology in the HRI space, and there are some challenges. Oftentimes, co-design processes can be long-term and have multiple sessions, and they're conducted over a long period of time. So it's a resource-intensive process. And also, it's very critical when you're doing this that you're ensuring that people feel valued and empowered throughout the whole co-design process. And then you establish this partnership between the people who are coming and being partners in the design process with the designers. And so since there is sort of it's not a common methodology and a lack of emphasis and work on equitable design processes like co-design and participatory design, I really believe that this suggests the need for more support and processes in this area for more of this responsible, equitable design. And so I think this is where design justice enters in very well when we think about how do we equitably and justly design these technologies. And so drawing from some HCI work, what I think design justice really allows us to think about is this explicit engagement with social justice that can really help guard against the tendency of entrenching inequities and power relationships and really facilitates this more equitable change. And it also attends to the ways that individuals experience oppression, including how benefits, burdens, obligations, power, opportunity, and privilege have been inequitably distributed in society. And where I think this relates to robotics is because with more people having access to robots and other people not having access, we run the risk of creating this robotic divide and where we create greater social inequities. And so I think that's why design justice at the forefront and thinking and design processes can be a really powerful tool. So like I said, I kind of talked about some of these areas, but now I want to think about, okay, with that top relationship of users and designers, how do we really go about engaging in more equitable design? So first, I'm going to talk about how do we empower users through the co-design of robots, drawing on some of the work that I've previously done. And so, like I said, we have seen participatory design and co-design in robotics, but it's not a common methodology and there are some limitations. And so one of the things that we wanted to really focus on is having co-design paired with having this long-term experience with a social robot, which would really allow people to understand what is this technology and how would they want it to be in the future designed by leveraging a lived experience. And so we also wanted to support this goal by having this be a longitudinal methodology and provide some structure and guidance for people who want to be engaging in this more hands-on, really long-term engagement with communities. And so for this particular project, we did a year-long co-design process, and we worked with 28 older adults from 70 to 94 years of age. And the process was broken down into 7 different stages. And if you want to read more about the individual stages, you can see our Roman paper that came out last year. I can also talk a little bit more about them if you're interested, but for the purpose of this talk, I'm just going to kind of leave them here as you can know all the different steps that were happening. And these steps all occurred over that year-long period. We were very lucky that we were able to kind of wrap up everything before the COVID pandemic. So you will see a lot of unmasked photos here. And one of the core things that came from this work was that we really identified 10 long-term co-design guidelines to support more equitable design processes. And really kind of boils down to this idea of we're designing with people in these sustained partnerships and really focusing on collaboration as well. And so what you'll see in the next slides is you'll see some numbers. Those numbers actually pair to the paper I was referencing. So they may seem a little out of order. I just picked a selection for you to kind of get an idea of what parts we were really drawing on for this work. So the first one was one of the benefits of having a long-term co-design was this ability for us to really have this long-term data analysis and mapping of opinions, such as from the initial interview to the reflection interview. And we could really understand what are the benefits and value of a long-term co-design process. We also really focus and emphasize creating space and time to establish rapport and relationships with the participants. So before even engaging in the work, some of the sessions was just for them to get to know our research team and for us to set up what are going to be our collaborations, what is expected from everyone, and how are we going to engage. And also just to make people feel comfortable in working with us in a research and design context. We also really stressed regular communication and respecting participants' time and effort because, like we said, it was a year-long process with 7 different stages. So this meant we did things like come to their houses and work with them on their kitchen table and really respect whatever they needed to be done. And also we're really flexible with our timeline. One of the really key things that we saw so much value in was when we had people live with a social robot in their home, and we had them live with it for a minimum of a month before checking in on them. But some people kept it for like more than a year, which was really exciting. But it was really something that they referenced as supporting them in their design process because they knew what this robot was, they created a mental model about it, and it impacted their design decisions and also made them feel more empowered in knowing this is what a social robot is, this is how I lived with it, and this is what I like about it, and this is what I don't like about it. And to help express their opinions, we provided them a diverse set of activities for people to engage in design in multiple ways, whether that was creating artwork to explain themselves and the relationship they would have with the robot, such as can be seen here. We also had interviewing with card sorting to make it a little more tangible and help people sort through ideas. we actually had people sit down and program interactions on the robot and design kind of what they would see the robot doing for them. And so that was done in flows like this. And so kind of that idea of, who gets to be a programmer and who can be a programmer was kind of discussed a little bit in this work. We also brought everyone together to be the generators of the design guidelines at the end of this process to lead the direction for the project. And within the whole process, we really were making sure that we had a multidisciplinary environment. So we worked with computer scientists, designers, and then all of the older adults, and really worked at every stage was to make sure that older adults' voices were amplified in the social robot design process. And this included, bringing everyone together and working to understand each other's perspectives and opinions and ideas, and really foster that team environment and connection for both of our groups. And so lastly, the guideline that I think is the most important that I always share is that it is really critical to establish these long-term respectful and mindful commitments and relationships. So the study part was a year-long commitment, but since then we have continually been engaging with this group. We meet monthly. We talk about study updates, we'll share papers, we tell them what the next development is if they want to get involved, but we also just talk. We have speakers come in and talk about different ideas. We'll talk to them about, robots and science fiction, just to keep a community very strong and just really make it, I guess the way to describe it, we like a long-term learning community is kind of what it's shaped out to be. And so I talked about the co-design guidelines, but there are definitely more things that have come from this process. We've looked at the stories that the people have told, what is the value of older adults living with a robot, and questioning the boundaries of who gets to be a robot designer. And so the QR code on the screen here will link you to the publication page for all those. But like I said, I just really wanted to focus on those guidelines for what we think will help foster more equitable co-design practices. But before we move on to the next project, I do want you to hear some of the ways that people were describing and talking about the benefit of being involved and why they enjoyed it and kind of their hopes for the future.
Took some of the mystery out of it. Mm-hmm. And I understand there are probably lots of different ways of doing it, but it gave me a little bit of insight into the whole into the whole area of programming.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's really quite interesting. I've always thought of programming must be very boring, but this was quite interesting.
I think that this really makes me feel a part of this whole study. And I appreciate that, that our opinions matter, and that even though we're not programmers or, electrical engineers like our son, that we were still able to do some simple programming, and I think that's fun.
Keep us involved. We're curious, and we'd like to see how this works.
So overall, I think with this work, what it really sums down to is that we can support and empower people to co-design social robots. And that really brings us back to that first point of, empowering users through the co-design of robots as a really powerful way for us to think about creating more equitable design processes. And so the next areas I'm going to talk about is now looking closer back at that roboticist. So, what are human robot interaction design processes right now, and how equitable are they? And then also thinking about how do we create spaces for equitable technology design? So again, this is the relationship that I've been talking a lot about, and we've really focused on that user stakeholder side, and co-design and participatory design fit really well into there. But then there's also this roboticist side, and we can promote equitable design methodologies, but we first also really need to understand that roboticist side as well as the dynamic between these two different stakeholders. And so when I mean talking about roboticists, what I really am referring to is thinking about this more reflexive lens onto the roboticist. And so reflexivity or a reflexive lens really help support self-reflection and examination of biases, power relationships, and how are these things being incorporated into the design process, into the design output. So I think it's a really critical way to be looking at the HRI community. And the way that I have been doing this in my work and working with collaborators on is through interviews with researchers to understand the tools and methodologies that they use, and how do they kind of bring in users into that process. Also thinking about the second project that we've really worked on was looking at syllabus of engineering classrooms where a lot of roboticists kind of had their starts, and understanding, okay, well, how are they relating to design justice? And then lastly, one of these things is a literature review, and this is the one I'm going to spend the most time on. And so in this literature review, what we really wanted to do in this space, and the reason I bring this up now is this paper is also coming out in Roman, and I think it's a really timely thing to have coming out, but we're specifically looking at the human-robot interaction field and trying to understand, okay, how has this field engaged with ethics, equity, and justice? So for ethics, a lot of people may be familiar with the different lenses that roboticists approach that space. And they do it in actually 5 different ways that I can talk more about if you're interested in. But we found a ton of papers around ethics, and we were finding much, much less around equity and justice. So we were searching for these keywords of equity and justice, and really only found 1 paper that came up under the justice category, and none with equity. So we then thought maybe there's different words that people are describing this with. So we went back to the ethics papers and further analyzed them to try to understand, were there components of equity and justice in those ethics papers that were, talked about as an ethical lens, but maybe they also incorporated these topics. And what we found is, about 26% really discussed equity, and 30% of the papers we reviewed focused on or discussed justice. It wasn't really a key focus. It was much more discussed around the topic they were wanting to discuss in the paper. And so after realizing that there's a big gap of not having a lot of very upfront conversations around equity and justice in the literature, we decided to really restructure and think about a new way to look at HRI through a more equitable design lens. And so just as a refresher, when I say equitable design, it's that idea of interrogating the inequities in society, deconstructing the privilege of design methods, and really recentering the focus of individuals who are historically underserved. And so the way that we did that is we took these 7 design justice questions. And so for each of these words, there's a question tied to it. And I'm happy to discuss these more in detail for people who aren't familiar or want to learn more about it. And these are, again, coming from the Design Justice Network and described by Sasha K in some of her work on this space. And each of these, really break down different areas of how a researcher could question different things, such as the values embedded in the process or into a product, or who is benefiting from a design, or how is the design site situated? How do we scope our problems? So they're really well-structured questions that we thought made it really great for people to translate to HRI. So that's what we did. We took these 7 questions and we translated them to HRI to be a little more specific for roboticists. And we also then added 6 different questions that we felt were very important related to robotics technology. So for example, entry and exit was one that we felt was very important to include when we're bringing a system into someone's home or into a hospital. How should we think about, really bringing it in, and what is the responsible way to bring it into a space? And then how do you bring it out? So thinking about, if we put a robot in this space and they have a lot of benefits, whoever participating with the robot has benefits from the technology, what's the responsible way to bring that technology out, since it was for research maybe, or for testing, and it wasn't for the person to keep forever? And so these are just some of the things that we felt were really salient and important. And I'm happy to discuss more cases of how these apply to roboticists or to the HRI field. But really, this framework we feel is a tool that we are in the process of testing to see how could roboticists be using this to really think more and make equitable design something that's more front and centered in their work, and also when they write about it as well. And so in summary, my talk, I focus on co-design, I focus on the robotics and this kind of dynamic between the two of them. And really what I want you to take away from this is that we really can support and empower people to be co-designing social robots through equitable design processes. And, not only thinking about only from that user side, but turning a lens back on us, the roboticists, the designers in the space, and thinking about how do we reshape our field, our design processes, so that we can make robot design a much more equitable and responsible process. And then again, if you wanted to see the papers on the co-design, I just left a QR code up there. But I'm really excited to chat more about this. I know I did a pretty high level overview of things. And so I'm really looking forward to kind of going more in depth or answering any questions you may have. And yeah, thank you again for listening.
Thank you so much that was a really good talk. I know I learned a lot. For our audience, if you guys have questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or feel free to also just put it into the chat, and Anastasia, we can go through the questions one by one and answer them if people choose to ask that way. I actually do have a question. I can start us off, and then people can move on that way. So I worked at Diligent Robotics when I was in college. That's a company that aims to create robots for healthcare. And I mean, I'm sure, as you can imagine, that's a space where equitable design is very important. It's a very role where you're interacting directly with the patient. I was wondering if you had any insights for robot design techniques for spaces like the healthcare, education, places where the robots directly interact with the end user in a very
Yes.
public case as well.
Yeah, no. So the framework I discussed, I think that is a tool that actually for my dissertation research, I'm taking that tool and thinking about, how do research teams in industry or in a research lab, how can they use that and really think about it in that level to problems that are applicable to them. So with that framework, we've come up and thought about these hypothetical, sort of more like design fiction case studies of how this could be applied or how the components relate to HRI spaces. But we're also kind of in that process of let's see how this really would work as a tool in the real world. So that's why we're targeting working with industry teams that design robotics. And also we're looking at academic teams that design robots. And so that's kind of where we are now. And then the third level that we're really interested in that we're working on as well is taking frameworks like this. So we also have a similar one for engineering design that's led by one of my collaborators. And so we have this one for robotics, and let's see how we can take that into a classroom and how does that work for a student's design process. And so it's really exciting because I think we've spent a lot of time laying this groundwork. I think that's what a lot of my work on the roboticist side has been, is what's going on with the field, how are people thinking about it. And now it's exciting because now we're finally having tools, or we have evidence and understanding of what's going on, that we can now work to really support people more in these spaces. Because I think most roboticists are in engineering backgrounds, and in most schools, the curriculum isn't around these topics of equity or justice. And so you kind of have to come at it from two sides. There's the education side and making sure a young roboticist gets this education, but also for people who are practicing right now, how do you give them the tools so they themselves have an understanding, but then they can also go and collaborate with communities. They can collaborate with the design researchers who have experience in this space to make it a more holistic team. And I think you see that in healthcare as well. When you're designing a robot, you go talk to the clinician, or you'll talk to some patients. And so I think there's a lot of really great work being done. And then we see this as a tool that can really help support these areas that maybe a person's not trained in.
That makes total sense. I like how you talked about dealing with the technical issues simultaneously with also thinking about these ethical and equitable issues. Oh, we have some people raising their hand. I saw Jonathan first. If you want to unmute maybe or ask your question.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. Hey, Anastasia, thank you for the really educational talk. It was good to hear from you. So it's an interesting framework, and I was curious if there was any way to implement it into industry to improve existing robots in the workspace, because I know that you gave a couple of examples of robots that were introduced into the workspace that didn't really work out, like with the Amazon warehouse or with the New York Police Department. But for like the potential applications of existing products like robot arms working at the cash register to help with food scanning, or improvements to surgical robots and hospital suites, the stuff that already exists that's been designed for a unique purpose. Do you think that this framework could be used to improve what's already been implemented?
Yes, I do. I do think it's broad enough to also talk about, or be applied to robots that are already out there. And I think, with a lot of robotics research, right, most people don't use a robot that's from scratch. A lot of people are using these systems that are created somewhere else, and they buy it and use it in their research. So even when we discuss about the framework, we're also thinking about for a study. Like if someone is using a robot that's already developed for the study, how can these questions be thought about around that study context? Or if you're taking a robot that's already made and you're implementing it into a new context, what are the things you should consider around that new context? And so we kind of thought about it in these different levels, and I'm really excited that the next step is testing it in some of these spaces. So we're right now working on translating this framework into a workshop style, and in that workshop, working with different groups of people, whether that's an academic research lab or an industry lab, and taking a problem that they're working on. So it may not be like their robot, they're designing it from scratch, but how can they kind of leverage the framework to address their problems? Because we would really want this to be something that could be applied in multiple levels, because otherwise it probably won't be adopted very well or used because it's only for like a niche case.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Jonathan. I saw Irene next. Irene, if you could unmute. Thank you.
Hi. Oops, sorry, this is not helping much, but can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for the talk. It was really interesting. And I was wondering, when I think about co-design, I was just thinking like, okay, everyone has certain set of expectations when it comes to robotics. And sometimes we tend to fall into more stereotypical ideas of what robots should look like. So do you have anything in your framework that kind of like fosters creativity, or that it can push us to think differently?
Yeah, so I didn't put this guideline in because I didn't want to, it's in the paper, but I don't want to spend too much time on it because it can be a little jargony, I guess. And one of the principles that we really set out to have in our co-design process was to make sure that we were fostering both convergent and divergent thinking. So divergent thinking meaning like opening up that idea space and allowing for idea generation, and then also making spaces for this idea convergence. So we're like kind of narrowing it down, whether that was, idea evaluation or selection. And so, like, for example, in the beginning of our process, when we were getting kind of to know us, the artwork phase, for example, was something that was highly divergent. It was like, let's make art on all these things. Like, what's your kind of level of this relationship? And then versus living with the robot was talked about by people in our study as something that was helping them converge to understand like, what level are we at nowadays? Because one of the problems, or not problems, but complications or hard things about robots, right, is we have science fiction. So, and we have like Star Wars and the Jetsons, and we don't have that level of technology right now. And so a lot of people will reference, when you're just talking to them, maybe at the beginning, they're like, oh yeah, like I definitely want the robot from the Jetsons, that's like my robot. And we're like, okay, oh, all right, that's what your lived experience has been when you think about robots. So what was really so powerful for the work we were doing was we had a robot that could be deployed just for people to live with and like understand, like, it sits on my kitchen table and why is it staring at me? Like, that's a very like classic design feature of Jibo, but it was something that they realized like the movement of the robot was something that wasn't going to work for them. And so then when we went on to the later parts of the process, it was really interesting because they kept referencing back like, well, when the robot was here, I didn't quite like that. Like, it wasn't useful for me. So when I prototyped the robot interaction, I'm going to not have that. And so they would like write out notes like, it's not going to be proactive, or like it's a proactivity setting that like I can turn on and off. And so they gave them a mental model to ground themselves in. And I think that was so critical. And then you kind of had to balance like, okay, they're converged on an experience, but how do you really make it open? And so the prototyping was super helpful because we gave them kind of variety of ways and just the different tooling. So there was like a comment feature where they could just describe these little things that maybe they couldn't prototype as well, but they were writing notes about all these things. That was super helpful. And then when we did the design guideline session, we also were making sure that there were some parts of it where we were very open-ended questions. And then there were other parts where we were going to narrow down on, okay, what are the top 10 design features moving forward that we want for this system for a specific activity. And so it was that balance. And we talk about like how critical it is to have that balance because of, you know, dealing with what are robot expectations, and then, you know, how do we also really empower people to feel like they can have more open ideation. I think before living with the robot and before the prototyping, it was a lot of, I'm not a robot designer, you're the robot designer, to which I responded, like, I can't design a robot, like, I'm really here just to foster your idea generation, which who knows if that helped. I think it was a rapport building time. But, you know, once they had the experience of living with the robot, they're like, these are my opinions on this robot. And then when they were prototyping, like, as you heard in some of the quotes, it was, now I feel like I am a programmer. Now I feel like I can design these interactions, because it was almost like by teaching about the programming or saying like, hey, you can program too, and here's how we're going to prototype, it lowered a barrier of maybe like, well, you're the robot designer and I'm not. And so another thing you struggle with in participatory design is just how do you navigate these power dynamics? And especially when you're an academic researcher and you're like, I'm the researcher, and there's an assumption of like authority or expertise, even though I did not have any expertise on the topic, but it was like something we had to constantly negotiate and renegotiate in that space. And it was something that like is really hard to get right. And actually, Taryn Mott from the Colorado School of Mines this past year in HRI, they published a paper on co-design, and they were looking at these ethical dimensions, but they have a really powerful section in there about power sharing. And I think that's something that's like very critical in a lot of these more in-depth engagements, and really critically thinking about that dynamic, because you can't get away from it.
Thank
that
you.
was a very long-winded way to answer your question.
No, it was great. Thank you.
Awesome. I don't see any questions in the chat or any hands raised. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the presentation, but of course, if you have any further questions, feel free to throw them in the chat right now or in the Slack channel after this call. I'll make sure to create the channel and everything right after. And before we wrap up, I just want to take a moment to talk about our next session. We're going to have Peter Cork from the Queensland University of Technology come in to talk. He has a variety of interests, a lot of expertise in the field of robotics and the history of robotics. So we're still nailing down exactly what his talk will be. But this will be the last Talking Robotics talk for this season before the organizers, take a little bit of a break to recharge and figure out where the series will be going next. So definitely tune in. It's going to be an amazing talk. He's a very, very great speaker and a super intelligent person. So definitely tune in. And finally, one final thank you once again to our sponsors for helping us bring this talk to life. It's been an incredible experience, and see everyone in 2 weeks. Thank you so much.